Your lecturer is Jennifer McNabb. Jennifer McNabb is a professor of history and the chair of the Department of History at Western Illinois University, where she has received multiple teaching awards. She received her PhD in history from the University of Colorado, Boulder. In 2018, Dr. McNabb was appointed as the chief reader for the Advanced Placement European History Development Committee. She has spoken and published on early modern Europe and has authored material for textbooks on Western civilization and European history.
Welcome to Renaissance. When I say the word Renaissance, it's likely that some very particular names and places and images come to mind. Some of you might right now be picturing Michelangelo's magnificent Colossus in marble, David. He stood guard over the Florentine Republic during its tumultuous 15th and 16th centuries. It's a good choice. David is in many ways emblematic of this famous age of rebirth that would move far beyond its Mediterranean origins and far beyond its celebration of classical culture and political life to embrace a breathtaking new vision of humanity. Or perhaps it's those vivid biblical scenes from Genesis played out across the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that exemplify Renaissance to you. That glorious moment of human creation itself, that striking image of God animating Adam with his touch, that might be the favored quintessential Renaissance image for some of you. For others, it's Leonardo's enigmatic Mona Lisa, or Botticelli's joyous celebration of renewal and beauty, the birth of Venus, or maybe his salute to La Primavera, spring. Or maybe you're imagining what just might be the most famous wedding portrait in history, that of an Italian banker and his bride, the so-called Arnolfini marriage portrait. The artist's declaration of his own role in commemorating the joining of husband and wife is pretty memorable itself. You might be calling to mind the artist's bold Johannes de Eyck Fuit Hic, or the fact that he appears to have painted his own reflection in the distant mirror behind the young couple. Maybe you associate Renaissance with a larger scale vision, a vista of the constructed horizon, a testament to humans' ability to transform the world around them in brick and stone and mortar and wood. So the grandeur and majesty of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, or San Marco in Venice, or Il Duomo in Florence might be leaping into your mind's eye when you hear Renaissance. These were monuments both to God and to the ingenuity and power of man. Another group of you might be associating the idea and practice of Renaissance with the scholars and writers whose names and work continue to exert a powerful claim to inclusion in the Western intellectual canon. Take Petrarch, for example. His infectious admiration for the ancients fostered a passion for classical text and moral exemplars from the classical world that helped land him the title, the father of humanism. Or Niccolo Machiavelli, an ardent supporter of citizen-oriented republican government, but far better known for his calculating, amoral treatise on statecraft, dedicated to princely authority. And then there's Erasmus, the so-called Prince of Humanists. His scathing indictments of the institutional church and contemporary social ills contributed to a cascade of criticism. It would inspire some to challenge the traditions of papal authority and initiate the Reformation. And what about major names in Renaissance literature and drama? William Shakespeare and Miguel Cervantes, to name just a pair of the most recognizable. Their earthy and creative language fused with astute assessments about human nature that reflected humanity at its most vulnerable, its most absurd, its most ambitious, and of course, It's most noble. Some of you are no doubt calling their names to mind as makers of Renaissance. Or it may be the case that you associate the Renaissance not with people, but with place, calling up a specific geography of Renaissance. You might be thinking of that memorable skyline of Florence, the city long heralded as ground zero of the Renaissance, populated with what just may be the greatest collection of geniuses assembled in the history of the Western tradition. Rome's certainly another contender, the home of the popes and the many humanists and artists in their employ. That makes another potential ground zero for Renaissance capital. Venice is another contender, perched precariously on the edge of the Mediterranean. Its great prosperity was a testament to its residents' determination and creativity. Or instead of thinking of individual cities or principalities, the territory synonymous with Renaissance to you might be the Italian peninsula in its entirety, that sandbox of the ancients and their Renaissance admirers alike. You could make a pretty solid case for the England of Sir Thomas More, and later of Kit Marlowe, Shakespeare, and Ben Jonson as a center of Renaissance culture too. And the Spain of Juan Luis Vives and Cervantes, the France of Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples. And then there's the Low Countries. Its northern United Provinces would emerge as one of the first global superpowers, whose fashions in scholarship and art would influence a continent and knit together the world. Excellent choices all. And then there's the figure whose identity and traits are so associated with the Renaissance that he shares its name. Renaissance man. You know him. He's a figure of wit and honor, of intellect and creativity. He's equally at home in the elegant trappings of the princely court and in the heat and smoke and chaos of the battlefield. He was as adept at drawing up a plan for battle as penning a love ballad and composing the tune to which its words should be set. And what about the intellectual gifts and the outlook of our Renaissance man? Some of you might have a tough time separating Renaissance from the new way of thinking and writing about the human experience that emerged after the catastrophe of the Black Death. That practice of learning through the lens of the ancients, but with a stunning new celebration of all that contemporary man could achieve. What's known as humanism. And I may not have even mentioned your Renaissance favorite yet. The choices are so many for this vibrant age that still exercises powerful sway over the popular imagination as a time of beauty and innovation and dynamism. This is the Renaissance we know. The familiar, marvelous, beautiful Renaissance that changed the course of history, first in the West and then around the world. This is the Renaissance that it's hard not to get excited about, often pointed to as the very herald of our own world, the origins of modernity itself. Except, of course, in all the ways it wasn't. There is, in fact, more, much more to the Renaissance than these familiar names and faces and buildings and ideas. There's another side to these centuries of achievement. A Renaissance, I'm guessing, is a little less familiar. Where painting and sculpture and architecture weren't so much about freewheeling creativity and artistic achievement as they were about big business. Where hard-headed, shrewd, carefully negotiated bargains bound artistic patrons and clients together in not unfrequently acrimonious relationships. Where artists fretted over their workshop's bottom line, while patrons demanded finished products that met exacting specifications of color and size and design. So much for the unfettered genius of the Renaissance artist. And then there's the Renaissance woman. Unlike her male counterpart, there was little to suggest she should behave all that much differently than her medieval predecessor. While humanists extolled the virtues of education as transformative, as capable of elevating man to dizzying new heights, they were far less effusive about woman's abilities. Women were to be chaste, silent, and obedient. It's that same trio of ingredients of good womanhood that stretched all the way back to the days of antiquity itself. For the handful of young women with access to the new learning of the humanists, what awaited at maturity was an agonizing choice between the abandonment of education for a normative, socially approved life of marriage and family, or a life of solitude with little opportunity to demonstrate or to apply their intellectual gifts. There's a reason we don't toss around the term Renaissance woman with the same ease as Renaissance man. Some modern scholars have suggested women didn't actually have a Renaissance. And so far, I've just been talking here about elite women. For those of lower status, the question of whether women were capable of the educational feats of Renaissance man didn't even register. These were women struggling with an endless list of domestic responsibilities. Some driven by limited options to the drudgery of service. Others driven by poverty to prostitution. And speaking of poverty, Renaissance Europe had a poverty problem, a big one. A series of economic challenges, punctuated by epidemic disease, endemic warfare, and all too frequent agricultural failures, created a sizable population of poor people, seeking relief from their neighbors and aid from religious and civil authorities. Sometimes the poor could be taken care of, and sometimes, when their numbers soared and overwhelmed their societies, they couldn't. The impoverished members of society were an object of both pity and fear. Concern for the aged and infirm and for widows and orphans could and did animate innovative schemes for assistance. But the specter of the sturdy beggar, who could work but refused to, provoked resentment and alarm about the preservation of good order. The cost of not addressing the problem of these idle poor was considered to be bigger than the sums grudgingly contributed to the relief efforts. To leave the poor to their own devices was to risk theft, riot, violence, and worse. I probably don't need to tell you that the poor wouldn't have much Renaissance either. The tensions their swelling numbers represented would lead instead to a new criminalization of poverty and the stigmatizing of the poor, both symbolically and physically. Their bodies were marked with disfiguring signs of their failure to adhere to the standards of their society, or their bodies were removed from that society, bound for distant lands, forced into military service, or transported. And many other undesirables found themselves targeted during the Renaissance, too. Quarrelsome women who aggravated their neighbors with disruptive speech, or worse, formed an allegiance with the devil to cause harm to their enemies through acts of witchcraft. Wrong-thinking Christians who threatened religious uniformity and good order with their misguided misinterpretations of the faith. Non-Christians whose presence within Europe destabilized both church and state, and whose presence on Europe's borders was a source of profound anxiety. The Renaissance, the age of artistic and literary giants, was also a time of violence and bloodshed. It was a time of holy war. Europe skirted along the edge of disaster in the face of Christian civil war that saw the cultural consensus of the Western tradition shattered by Reformation. Islamic expansion pushed at the edges of the Christian world and then drove across those edges, bringing terror in its wake. And Christian expansion would bring devastation to populations around the globe as Europeans sought new horizons. Indigenous people invariably got the wrong end of this international exchange. For those uninitiated to the Afro-Eurasian trading network that stretched back to classical antiquity, there was little relief from the diseases Europeans brought with them on their voyages of exploration. This too was Renaissance. Bloodshed and intolerance and disorder and transgressive behavior. Now, those characteristics might not have come so readily to mind when I first said Renaissance. Maybe some of you know something about this less familiar Renaissance. But getting up close and personal to those elements of the Renaissance takes work. It takes a bit of digging to uncover the other side of the Renaissance, underneath the tempera of the frescoes, beyond the shining marble, and away from the movable type of the new printing presses that facilitated an information revolution. Why? Why does this glorious, glittering Renaissance get the lion's share of the attention? Because Renaissance mastered the art of self-promotion. The most familiar Renaissance voices that echo down to us through the centuries belong to a relatively small group of elites, almost always men, who articulated deliberately, eloquently, persuasively, their participation in a new age of human history. They even pioneered a new way of thinking about history itself, and they cast themselves in the starring role of its new heights. Let me refine the point by considering the contrast between this idea and the Renaissance's immediate predecessors. Evidence suggests that medieval people didn't actually know they were medieval. For those in the Middle Ages who thought about such things, they believed themselves to be directly connected to the days of antiquity. Time for them was linear, proceeding from the classical age to their own, without much interruption. These medieval people saw themselves as heirs of the classical world, the descendants of the classical age. There was no middle for them to occupy, after all. That notion of their middleness was in fact a product of the Renaissance, whose thinkers looked behind them in disdain in an age they deemed inferior to their own. So then, did Renaissance people know they were experiencing a Renaissance, living in a new age that was linked to the classical world after a barbarous period of interruption, a time without learning, without culture, without achievement? You bet. Some of them most certainly did. Or at least they wrote that they were living in a new age. In fact, it might be more accurate to say that they wrote themselves a new age. And here's where this picture of Renaissance gets even more gloriously messy and complicated. The Renaissance we know, the one with all of the big names that I started off describing, might actually be the very greatest Renaissance work of art of them all. The Renaissance writers who described their age of gold were creating a product, and in so doing, they were speaking directly to us. Well, not to you and me in particular, but certainly to posterity. These Renaissance intellectuals described their own world through the lens of the past and as a celebration of their present, but also with an eye to the future. Letter by letter, word by word, treatise by treatise, they constructed for themselves an age that would represent a pinnacle of human achievement. An achievement made possible by standing on the shoulders of giants. These makers of Renaissance would give new life to the ancient world by knowing those ancient thinkers and statesmen and poets and playwrights whose culture they wished to resurrect and then surpass. This is the myth of the Renaissance, as a volte-face of the preceding centuries of darkness. Yes, we can thank the Renaissance for that most famous of medieval labels, the Dark Ages. The Renaissance would, by contrast, represent a return of the light of civilization. But it's a construct, and we're its current audience. It's a pretty spectacular myth. It's a story of great men and their deeds, in the halls of government, on the battlefield, in the courts, in the universities, both near and far from home. And like all of the very best stories, it has its fair share of truth, this legendary Renaissance. The Renaissance was an age of oils and bronze, and ink and paper that represented dazzling human achievement. But for every way in which the Renaissance seems to represent the coming of our modern sensibilities of life and of love and of faith and of materialism, there are many ways in which the Renaissance represents continuity with the preceding centuries. In this course, we'll be consumers of the Renaissance brand, but we'll be discerning customers. Of course, we'll study the Renaissance as it advertised itself, but we'll also look carefully for the truth in those advertisements. In that task, we're helpfully aided by the Renaissance itself. Not everyone then was enamored of their world, after all. And the critical eye that some turned on the laws and institutions and traditions of their own day can assist us in gaining perspective on the Renaissance. The methodologies of the rebirth itself, asking questions, challenging authorities, seeking accuracy in the details, understanding the human condition, actually prepared these dissenting voices to launch their salvos at Renaissance Incorporated. During the lectures in this course, we'll receive the Renaissance its creators have given us. But we'll also be employing those very same critical methods they formulated and refined to evaluate the received Renaissance. So is this about us tipping some sacred cows, myth-busting the Renaissance? A little bit. As my comments have already suggested, there's much more to the Renaissance than appears to a casual observer. Since we'll be observing a little less casually, we'll see all sorts of things about the Renaissance centuries that don't appear in the typical narratives that celebrate the coming of modernity. Some of these things will even disturb traditional understandings of the Renaissance. And some, I think, will make the Renaissance even more impressive than you already knew it was. What lies beneath really is one of the greatest stories ever told. Yes, the Renaissance excluded many from its vaunted celebration of humanity. There's no disputing that, and there's no getting around it. But what a celebration of humanity the Renaissance did create. There was a truly remarkable recognition of humanity as a subject worthy of study, of improvement, of admiration. The Renaissance bequeathed to us a novel spin on a very old idea, one that they borrowed and then adapted from the ancients, that humans were capable of living a good, meaningful life, and that the pursuit of that good life was a truly noble and ennobling endeavor. What a game changer of an idea that was. Here's why. During the Middle Ages, humanity was nothing to celebrate. Christian theologians focused on sin, on the fallen state of humankind. God's mercy saved creatures whose innate wretchedness should have damned them. There was nothing really inspiring in the experience of being human in such a figuration. Being human was a chronic condition without a cure, aside from a loving God whose sacrifice redeemed the unworthy. And that's the key word here. Humans were unworthy. But in the 14th century, with the birth of what we call the Renaissance, there were stirrings of an alternate way of thinking about humans, not as ruined, but instead as worthy. And not by the old Christian markers of worthiness, not exclusively, but by the measure of something else. This doesn't mean that the Renaissance represented a rejection of religion. Far from it, as we'll see. But this shift in thinking about the human experience allowed for a different kind of redemption of humanity, one focused on the here and now rather than the hereafter. Where did this idea come from, this focus on the business of being human? It was embedded in the West's own cultural and intellectual heritage, a heritage that had been lost or displaced when Roman authority succumbed to its long twilight. Humanism wasn't new. It was very old, a product of the Greco-Roman tradition that intellectuals such as Petrarch began to take a keen interest in as they sought to find meaning during times of crisis. In the process, they posed a series of questions about what it means to live a good life that are as relevant for us today as they were 600 years ago. They're so relevant, they seem more ripped from the headlines than ripped from the history books. What is the value of education? What defines good governance? What determines a person's worth? What justifies war, violence, and even revolution? What forces shape personal and collective identity? What role should faith play in the human experience? What is the relationship between a person's material condition and quality of life? Renaissance thinkers believed that turning to the ancients could help answer those questions. And that meant first tracking down the ancients in their own words and on their own terms. It was a massive project of recovery that Renaissance figures embraced with the devoted zeal of the true convert. But the Renaissance was about more than just mimicking the ancients. These practitioners of Renaissance didn't merely want to read and to study the ancients. They wanted to be in conversation with them. Sometimes literally, as when Petrarch wrote letters to his ancient hero, the Roman statesman Cicero. More often, though, this communication took the form of studying the lessons and legacies of the ancients and then asking, what would the ancients do? Renaissance thinkers believed that the ancients could serve as moral and political and intellectual exemplars, providing a path for them in the troubled times in which they lived. They believed that the past could serve as a guide to the present. But there was more. Because the Renaissance had something that the ancients didn't. They had Christianity. So the Renaissance not only had the benefit of the newly recovered ancient learning, it also had the wisdom and authority of the true faith. And what a potent combination that made. It was a truly dynamic duo. Christianity could provide answers to the human experience that not even the pagan ancients had been able to identify in their quest for knowledge. I'll go ahead and use the verbiage we'll find used in the Renaissance itself to give this next bit its full weight. This fusion of the classical and medieval worldviews mean that Renaissance man could be more than admirable, more than an exemplar. He was endowed with a capability for achievement that made him the very apex of creation. In the great chain of being that linked all creatures, man ranked only a little below the angels themselves. Man wasn't a failure, just the opposite. Man was the masterpiece. And what an astounding declaration that was. So we'll contest Renaissance in our course. We'll expose its limitations and we'll uncover its prejudices. But we'll also consider its contributions to and parallels with our own world in ways that I think you'll find enriches your understanding and appreciation for the Renaissance even more. So too, I hope, will our somewhat unconventional coverage of the Renaissance in terms of periodization. I'm sure it hasn't escaped your attention that our Renaissance will be an expansive one. In the opening modules of this course, we'll examine the people and places and chronology typically associated with the Renaissance. Although, to be fair, modern scholars themselves have trouble dating the Renaissance precisely. We'll begin in the Quattrocento, in the Italian lands, and move through Europe during the 15th and early 16th centuries. But we'll go beyond. Beyond Europe, to the new horizons sought by the West, and beyond the early 16th century, to tackle the cataclysm of religious fracture of the Reformation and to chart its unfolding impact. We'll study the ancients and their impact on the Renaissance, but we'll also move beyond them, seeking new answers to age-old questions about science and nature and the cosmos that involved the rejection of ancient authorities and the reconsideration of lost ancient voices. We'll study the art of diplomacy and the practice of war, too. Features of the Renaissance informed by the ancients, but modified by new contexts, new technologies, and new priorities. We'll juxtapose the advances associated with the Renaissance with the period's bitter hatreds and prejudices and inequities. Our scope is broad because I want us to see the Renaissance not as an event, but as a transformative process whose influences touched many areas of early modern life. You may have looked at some of the topics in our course abstract and thought to yourself, I didn't know that was part of the Renaissance, capital T, capital R. Now, the Renaissance didn't cause the Europeans' opening of a new chapter in world history. It didn't cause Reformation. It didn't make scientific revolution, or military revolution for that matter. But the Renaissance did establish some pivotal preconditions for these developments. During these lectures, I'll be asking you to think through the Renaissance lens, to see how the questions the Renaissance thinkers asked shaped centuries of ideals and realities. They remain with us today. We're still receiving the Renaissance even as we're products of it. So let's head to the 14th century, to Italy, and to Renaissance beginnings.